The sun rose gently over Lagos, casting soft light across worn rooftops and winding streets. For many, it was the start of an ordinary day. But for a team of heroes, it was the beginning of something that would change everything. Steve Rogers, known to the world as Captain America, moved silently through the morning shadows. Beside him were Natasha Romanoff, Wanda Maximoff, and Sam Wilson, an Avenger unit, alert and focused. Their mission: stop a theft before it endangered innocent lives. Hidden behind storefronts and market walls, the team closed in on their target, Brock Rumlow, once a Hydra agent, now wearing a grim mask and leading a strike unit. Rumlow wasn't there for chaos. He was there to steal a biological weapon. But the Avengers were ready. The encounter was swift, a blur of motion. Sam soared above with Red Wing, scanning corners and alleyways. Natasha fought with precision, disabling guards with graceful strikes. Wanda bent the world around her, her mind and magic weaving in tandem. But Rumlow had a plan. As Steve confronted him, Rumlow detonated a suicide vest. Wanda reacted on instinct, surrounding the blast with her energy. She lifted it away from the ground, but not far enough. The explosion tore into a nearby building, shattering glass and lifts. Later, in the stillness that follows disaster, Steve stood among debris and ash. He watched first responders dig through rubble, pulling out survivors and others who would not wake again. The guilt was silent, but heavy. The world had seen what happened. News reports echoed across the globe. Civilians had died. Among them were delegates from Wakanda. The public had grown weary of uncontrolled heroics. This was not the first time innocents had paid the price. Sokovia, Washington, now Lagos. Within days, a proposal was brought forward, the Sokovia Accords. 117 nations signed on, demanding that the Avengers operate only under the oversight of the United Nations. The team was summoned to Avengers headquarters. There, Secretary of State Thaddeus Ross presented a somber video montage: cities burning, buildings collapsing, faces crying. Then he delivered the ultimatum: sign the accords, or step down. Tony Stark was the first to speak. He'd recently met a woman named Miriam in a hallway after a lecture. She handed him a photo of her son, Charles Spencer, who died in Sokovia. Her quiet words struck deeper than any weapon ever had. That moment haunted him. Now, Tony believed in oversight. He believed they needed boundaries, not just power. "We need to be put in check," he said, voice firm but tired. "Whatever form that takes, I'm game." Steve disagreed. His voice was calm, steady, but resolute. "What if this panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go, and they don't let us?" To him, signing meant giving up the right to choose. And Steve had seen what happened when men gave up that right too easily. A line was drawn. Some, like Rhodey, Vision, and Black Widow, sided with Tony. Others, Wanda, Sam, and Clint Barton, stood with Steve. And in the background, a figure watched from the shadows. A man named Zemo, quiet and calculating. He had no powers, no suit, but he had a plan, one that would tear the Avengers apart, not from the outside, but from within. The stage was set. As the world debated the Sokovia Accords, another shadow began to stir. In a modest apartment in Bucharest, Bucky Barnes lived a quiet life. No headlines, no missions, just shadows and memory. For years, Bucky had been the Winter Soldier, controlled, shaped, and used by Hydra. But now, free from their grip, he moved cautiously through his days, hoping to stay invisible. But peace, for someone like Bucky, was always temporary. A bombing shook Vienna. A conference had gathered world leaders to finalize the accords. Among them was Chaka, the king of Wakanda. As dignitaries assembled, a silent explosion ripped through the building. Smoke, confusion, and panic followed. When the dust settled, Chaka was gone, killed instantly. Security footage showed the bomber, a man with long hair and a cold stare. The Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes. The world reacted swiftly. A manhunt was ordered. But Steve Rogers didn't hesitate. He knew Bucky. He believed in him, not the man he had been, but the one he could be. And when everyone else saw a threat, Steve saw his friend. He ignored orders, crossed borders, and found Bucky before the authorities could. Their reunion was brief and tense. Bucky remembered fragments, faces, pain, missions he wished he could forget. But Steve's presence brought clarity, a piece of the past that still felt real. Their moment was interrupted by chaos. The authorities had arrived, and they weren't alone. A new figure joined the chase. Clad in black, swift and fierce, the man moved with feline grace. His name was Chala, son of Chaka, the new king of Wakanda. But more than that, he was something ancient, the Black Panther. Fueled by grief and purpose, Chala pursued Bucky relentlessly, not as a symbol, but as a son seeking justice. The pursuit tore through narrow alleys and across rooftops. Steve, Sam, Bucky, and the Panther collided in bursts of motion, all while the city struggled to catch its breath. In the end, they were caught not by fists, but by force. All four were arrested and brought to Berlin. Steve and Sam were placed under watch. Chala remained composed, his eyes steady. Bucky was held in a secure cell, and a man claiming to be a psychiatrist arrived to evaluate him. But the man was not who he claimed to be. It was Zemo. Quietly, methodically, Zemo activated the Winter Soldier. Using trigger words from Hydra's old programming, he pulled Bucky back into the nightmare. The transformation was sudden, violent. Bucky's expression turned blank, his movements exact. He broke free. The compound erupted in chaos. Bucky tore through guards and walls, his metal arm crashing through steel and concrete. But Steve was there fighting not to win, but to save. He called out to Bucky, not as an enemy, but as a friend. The spell broke, slowly. The man behind the programming resurfaced. Steve and Sam took Bucky and escaped, hiding once more. There, Bucky told them what he remembered, a secret Hydra facility, a location in Siberia. And most importantly, there were others. Other Winter Soldiers, enhanced and dangerous, locked away but still alive. Zemo was heading there, not for power, not to awaken them, but for something else, something darker. Steve knew what he had to do, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Tony struggled. The Accords were law, but Steve's actions had crossed lines. Still, Tony wanted peace. He wanted to fix the fracture before it widened. He sought help from someone new. In Queens, a teenager returned home from school. Peter Parker. Smart, awkward, kind-hearted. He had a secret. He was Spider-Man. Tony saw promise in him, not just in his abilities, but in his heart. He offered Peter a new suit, a chance to be part of something bigger, a chance to prove himself. Tony assembled a team: Rhodey, Vision, Black Widow, Chala, and now Peter. They would intercept Steve before he could leave the country. Steve's side had grown, too. Hawkeye returned. Wanda escaped house arrest. Ant-Man, Scott Lang, joined, wide-eyed and ready, still amazed to be among legends. The collision point, Leipzig-Halle Airport. The air was still before it began. There were no speeches, no battle cries, just the quiet recognition that friends were about to fight. The sky over Leipzig-Halle Airport was quiet. Gray clouds drifted overhead, soft and slow, masking the tension that simmered below. Two teams stood on opposite sides of the tarmac, once friends, now separated by conviction. There was no music, no spotlight, just the sound of footsteps on concrete, of wind brushing across glass hangars. The space between them was open and vast, yet filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Steve Rogers stood calmly, his shield resting on his forearm. To his left and right were Sam, Wanda, Scott Lang, Clint Barton, and Bucky, each of them wearing the same expression, not anger, but purpose. On the other side, Tony Stark hovered slightly above the ground in his Iron Man suit, flanked by Rhodey, Vision, Black Widow, Chala in his Black Panther armor, and the newest arrival, Peter Parker, already suited up as Spider-Man. Peter's eyes darted around. This was his first big moment, but he could feel how serious it all was. He tried to lighten the mood with nervous chatter. "Hey everyone," he said with a little wave. But the smiles were faint. There was still hope, somewhere in Tony, in Steve, that this wouldn't end in violence. Maybe they could talk. Maybe someone would step back. But time had run out. Steve needed to get to Siberia. He believed Zemo was about to unleash a terrible danger, other Winter Soldiers, trapped in stasis, but capable of destroying everything. He didn't want to fight, but he wouldn't let anyone stop him. Tony, bound by the law and haunted by the Vienna bombing, couldn't let him leave. He truly believed that Steve was doing the wrong thing and that the consequences could be devastating. The silence broke with a single motion. Words gave way to action. Sam took to the sky, wings wide and quick. Iron Man followed, jets roaring to life. Clint fired arrows that curved in midair. Vision responded with focused energy beams. Each move was precise, controlled. No one wanted to hurt anyone too badly. Then came Spider-Man. He swung through the scene with wonder in his voice and strength in his limbs. He snagged Steve's shield with a web line, catching everyone off guard. That thing doesn't obey the laws of physics at all, he commented mid-swing, the only one smiling through the chaos. Steve reclaimed his shield with a calm nod. Kid, where are you from? Queens. Brooklyn, Steve replied, and the two exchanged a strange, brief grin in the middle of battle. Elsewhere, Wanda used her powers to move crates and hold back enemies with invisible force. Ant-Man grew large, towering over the tarmac in a moment of comic awe. I'm Giant Man now, I guess, he shouted, blocking a path with his massive form. Tony stared up at him in disbelief. The fight, though grand in motion, was oddly restrained. Everyone pulled their punches. These weren't enemies, they were friends caught in something larger than themselves. Black Panther moved like silence on the wind. His pursuit was not political, it was personal. His focus was on Bucky, the man he believed had killed his father. But through it all, Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, watched the fight with growing discomfort. She'd chosen Tony's side, but her heart was torn. She knew both men. She understood their pain. And when the time came, when Steve and Bucky made their final push to escape, Natasha acted. She stepped aside, just long enough to let them pass. Are you serious? Chala asked, voice sharp. I said I'd help bring them in. I didn't say how, she replied, quietly. Steve and Bucky made it to a jet and disappeared into the sky. The others were not so lucky. Tony's team captured Sam, Wanda, Clint, and Scott. They were taken to a secret facility called the Raft, a high-security prison in the middle of the ocean, a place made for enemies, not friends. As Tony stood alone in the aftermath, he felt none of the victory he'd hoped for. Instead, there was only silence and a growing doubt. Had he done the right thing? Snow fell gently in the Siberian wilderness, blanketing the land in quiet. There were no cities here, no witnesses, just a cold wind and a hidden bunker buried beneath the ice and stone. Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes arrived first. The journey had been long, and the weight of what might await them pressed heavily on both. Deep within the facility, Steve believed they would find Hydra's secret, other Winter Soldiers, enhanced like Bucky, frozen in stasis, and waiting. They moved through the corridors carefully, their footsteps echoing faintly through metal halls. Every door creaked with memory. Every light flickered like a remnant of something long forgotten. But they weren't alone. Tony Stark had followed. Despite everything, the battles, the arrests, he still wanted resolution. When he learned that Steve and Bucky had gone to Siberia, he went after them, not in anger, but in a desperate search for truth. He was met by a fragile truce. For a moment, the three stood together again, like old friends, tired, scarred, but united by a shared history. Together, they entered the final chamber. It was quiet. 5 cryogenic pods lined the wall, each one containing a soldier, still frozen, still armed with the power Hydra had given them. But something was wrong. Zemo had been here first. The pods were open, but the soldiers inside were gone. Not because Zemo had awakened them, but because he had ended them. One by one, he had destroyed them. Steve stared, confused. Why would he come all this way, just to kill them? Zemo stepped out from the shadows. Calm, composed. No weapons. No army. Just the truth. He began to speak not with rage, but with quiet sorrow. His voice was filled with grief, not vengeance. He told them of his home, of Sokovia, of the day the sky fell, and with it, his family, his wife, his child, his father, gone. Not because of Hydra, not because of aliens, because of the Avengers. Zemo had no intention of controlling power. He wanted to break it, not by fighting them head-on, but by turning them against each other. And then he showed them a video from 1991. A security feed captured late at night on a lonely road in the forest. A car driving peacefully, unaware of what was about to happen. A flash, a crash, a blur of metal and shadow. The Winter Soldier. Bucky. Under Hydra's control, Bucky had been sent to intercept a vehicle carrying a cargo of super soldier serum. But that wasn't all the car held. It also carried Howard and Maria Stark, Tony's parents. The footage played out slowly. The Winter Soldier dragged Howard from the wreckage. There was no hesitation, no mercy. Tony watched in silence. Then his voice broke. "Did you know?" he asked Steve, eyes full of hurt. Steve hesitated. "I didn't know it was him," he whispered. "Not at first." But it wasn't enough. The room fell cold, not from the weather, but from the betrayal. Tony's pain erupted into fury. "You killed my mom," he said to Bucky, voice trembling, barely above a whisper. And then it began. Iron Man attacked. The bunker became a battlefield. Fist struck with emotion more than precision. Tony fought like a son mourning a stolen childhood. Steve fought to protect a friend. Bucky fought simply to survive. Walls cracked. Sparks flew. The silence of Siberia shattered. At one point, Steve tried to reason. "This won't change what happened." "I don't care," Tony answered. "He killed my mom." In those words was everything: grief, rage, helplessness. They battled down corridors, over steel grates, under hanging lights. Tony disabled Bucky's metal arm with a blast, nearly pinning him beneath debris. But Steve stepped in, shielding his friend once more. It ended where it had begun. 3 men, broken and breathless. Steve gained the upper hand, slamming his shield into Tony's arc reactor. It sputtered, flickered, and powered down. Tony lay on the floor, stunned. Steve stood over him, battered, breathing hard. "That shield doesn't belong to you," Tony said quietly. "My father made that shield." Steve paused. Then, without a word, he dropped the shield beside Tony and walked away, Bucky limping beside him. There were no victors, only survivors. The dust had settled in Siberia, but the weight of what happened there would linger far longer than any bruises or broken walls. Tony Stark sat alone in the ruins of the Hydra bunker. The arc reactor on his chest flickered dimly, sparks trailing through the silence. Around him, snow drifted in through cracks in the ceiling. He didn't chase after Steve or Bucky. He didn't speak. He simply stayed still. For all his armor, Tony had never felt more exposed. Elsewhere, a high-security prison sat in the middle of the ocean, cold, efficient, and distant. The Raft. Within its walls were the remnants of Steve's team: Sam Wilson, Clint Barton, Scott Lang, and Wanda Maximoff. Each of them held in separate cells, the sea muffling every sound, the walls humming with quiet surveillance. Tony arrived, unannounced, to visit them. Sam met him with silence. Not anger, just disappointment. "You're not as smart as you think," he said softly. "You're not seeing the whole board." Tony tried to justify the choices he'd made, the law, the accords, the line he believed had to be drawn. But in that moment, the lines felt meaningless. And then Sam told him what mattered. Steve had gone underground. Yes, but he hadn't abandoned anyone. He'd come for them. Soon after, security systems at the raft were compromised. The lights flickered. Alarms buzzed briefly, then fell quiet. Steve had come. Not with violence, but with purpose. With a plan. He freed his friends from their cells and disappeared into the shadows. From that day forward, they became ghosts, operating in secret, helping where they could, no longer under any jurisdiction. They were no longer the Avengers, at least not in name. But their mission hadn't changed. Back in New York, Tony returned to his lab. He walked through empty rooms filled with memories, screens that once monitored the world now showing static. The Avengers compound felt hollow without the people who had once filled it. He began repairing War Machine's armor. Rhodey, injured during the airport battle, now used leg braces to walk. His spirit remained strong, his wit undiminished, but things had changed. Some scars didn't fade. Meanwhile, in Wakanda, a peaceful mountain range stretched beneath the clouds. T'Challa, now king, had offered sanctuary to Bucky Barnes. There, in a chamber filled with soft light and ancient wisdom, Bucky chose to return to cryogenic sleep. "I can't trust my own mind," he said. "Not yet." Steve stood beside him, understanding. "We'll find a way," he promised. "You won't be alone." And so Bucky slept again, not as a weapon, but as a man seeking peace. Steve remained for a time in Wakanda, hidden from the world, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. The shield, his emblem, his symbol, he had left behind. But the ideals it stood for remained within him. Later, Tony received a package. Inside was a letter, handwritten. Steve's voice echoed through the words, not angry or apologetic, but honest. Tony, I'm sorry. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to cause you more pain. I know I hurt you. I know you may never forgive me. But I hope one day you'll understand why I had to act. Folded inside the letter was a flip phone. If you ever need us, the note read, we'll be there. It wasn't a truce. Not yet. But it was a bridge. Somewhere in the quiet between pages of that letter, Tony felt something shift. Not closure, but the beginning of healing. The Avengers were gone, for now. Scattered, wounded, changed, but not broken. In the months that followed, the world moved on, unaware of how close it had come to falling apart from within. People still believed in heroes. Some even whispered that the Avengers might return one day, reborn in new form. And beneath the surface, in labs and safe houses and hidden kingdoms, those heroes waited, watching, preparing, and holding on to the hope that, even after everything, they could still make things right. Time passed slowly after the Avengers fractured. There were no more press conferences, no citywide battles, no heroic entrances. Just quiet. Yet, even in silence, their stories continued. Steve Rogers had let go of the stars and stripes, not because he had stopped believing in America, but because he believed in something deeper: people, choice, loyalty. When he looked back on the path that had led him from Brooklyn to Berlin, he didn't regret standing by Bucky's side. To Steve, friendship was a promise, one he would never break. He was a soldier without a uniform now, a protector in the shadows. Wherever there was injustice, Steve would still be there. You just wouldn't see him coming. Bucky Barnes rested in the still chambers of Wakanda, watched over by a people who understood the cost of transformation. In sleep, he found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. His mind, once fractured and used by others, was finally quiet. And for the first time in a long time, he was safe. Sam Wilson and Wanda Maximoff stayed off the grid, helping where they could. Sam kept his wings folded close, using them only when needed. He and Steve worked together, quietly saving lives. Wanda, still haunted by her powers, found comfort in doing small things: protecting villages, healing wounds, learning control. Clint Barton went home, back to the quiet life he'd always longed for. His children had missed him. His wife welcomed him with open arms. For a while, Clint lived among the fields, teaching his daughter how to aim and helping with dinner in the evenings. He never stopped watching the world, though. He knew that one day, someone might need him again. Scott Lang, the Ant-Man, returned to his daughter, Cassie. He shrunk away from the spotlight, but not from love. He made her laugh again, fixed her lunch, watched cartoons with her on the couch. In those quiet moments, he found something stronger than any suit: a reason. Tony Stark stayed at the compound, but the laughter that once echoed through its halls had faded. He spent hours in the lab, hands stained with oil and circuits, as if he could fix what had broken between him and Steve by fixing machines. He didn't speak about Siberia, not even to Rhodey, but he kept the flip phone Steve had sent. Sometimes he'd look at it. He never dialed. Not yet, but he kept it charged. Rhodey adapted to his new reality with strength. The braces allowed him to walk, but it wasn't easy. Still, he trained every day, kept moving. He told Tony, "You build the suit. I'll do the work." He meant it. That's who Rhodey was, someone who always stood up, no matter how hard the fall. Natasha Romanoff vanished. She'd betrayed the Accords in Berlin, and the government wasn't pleased. But finding her? That was another matter entirely. She was a ghost when she needed to be. And though she kept to herself, Natasha watched over her friends in her own way, from rooftops, from terminals, from quiet doorways in foreign cities. Chala ruled Wakanda with a steady hand. He had seen vengeance twist his heart, and he'd let it go. In that release, he found wisdom. He protected his people, nurtured his kingdom, and offered sanctuary not just to Bucky, but to the idea of peace itself. And Peter Parker, he returned to school. He kept his identity quiet, just as Tony had suggested. He helped neighbors, stopped bicycle thieves, and studied for math exams. He was still figuring it out, still becoming who he was meant to be. But when he lay in bed at night and looked out the window, the city blinking beyond the fire escapes, he held on to a quiet truth. The world was bigger than him. But that didn't mean he couldn't help make it better. And far from it all, somewhere in the world, Zemo sat in a cell. Alone. His mission complete. The Avengers were split. Damaged. But even he couldn't break what they stood for completely. Because something endured. Not the buildings. Not the titles. But the people. The hearts. The idea that doing the right thing didn't always come with applause. Sometimes it came with silence. With sacrifice. With pain. But also with meaning. Captain America. Civil War was not a battle of good versus evil. It was a quiet question that grew too loud to ignore. How far will you go for what you believe in? In the end, there were no easy answers. Only choices. And in the space between those choices, something softer began to grow. A path back. One day, perhaps not soon, the shield would be lifted again. The team would stand together once more. Not because they had forgotten, but because they had forgiven. In the months that followed, the world seemed to exhale. The skies were quieter, the headlines fewer. The thunder of battle had faded into memory. For the first time in a long while, the world wasn't looking at the Avengers, it was looking inward, healing, rebuilding, wondering if the heroes would ever return. But the truth is, heroes don't vanish. They simply move into the background, waiting for the next moment they're needed. And sometimes, they pass on their stories. Steve Rogers spent his days in places the world forgot. Not as a soldier, not even as Captain America, just as a man. He watched over communities, gave directions to strangers, helped rebuild houses damaged by storms. His shield was gone, but he still protected. In those quiet places, Steve often thought of Peggy Carter. He'd loved her once, long ago, before the ice, before the war, before everything changed. She had passed not long before the Accords, leaving behind a world she helped shape and a legacy Steve still carried. He remembered her words at her funeral. Compromise where you can, but where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and say, no, you move. Steve had planted himself like that. He didn't know if it was the right decision, but it was the honest one. Tony Stark, too, carried his past quietly. He thought often of his parents, Howard and Maria, of the choices that led them all to this place. He thought about how easy it had been to build walls with technology and how hard it was to mend bridges with words. The lab was his sanctuary, but even that began to feel less like armor and more like isolation. Sometimes he would pick up the flip phone Steve had left him. His thumb would hover over the call button. He never pressed it, but he never threw it away either. Each kept the other in mind, quietly, carefully, like a photograph folded neatly and tucked away in a drawer, not ready to be displayed, but never forgotten. The world changed slowly in their absence. People began to ask different questions about responsibility, about power, about the meaning of unity, not as a government decree, but as something chosen. And among the quiet, new voices began to rise. Children played in the streets again, tying blankets around their shoulders and calling themselves Avengers. Not because of battles, but because of what the name meant to them: bravery, kindness, and hope. In Wakanda, a place that had remained hidden for generations, light grew. King T'Challa had opened his heart, and one day, he would open his borders too. He watched over Bucky like a brother, making sure his mind healed completely. And in the stillness of the African forests, the man who had once been the Winter Soldier slowly became whole again. Elsewhere, Natasha moved through the world like a whisper. She was hunted now, but not by villains, by her own guilt. Still, she helped where she could, in refugee camps, in crisis zones, always in the background, always in motion. Even in exile, the Avengers kept watch. The shield lay quiet in a government facility, locked away like a museum piece, a reminder of what had been. But legacies don't live in steel. They live in people. And one day, someone else would pick it up. One day, the Avengers would be needed again. And when that day came, they would return, not as soldiers of a system, but as a family. Stronger, not because they agreed on everything, but because they had learned what it meant to fall and stand up again. In that long quiet, Filled with reflection, the world continued to turn. Sunsets came and went. Letters were written, and slowly, answers returned. And though the world didn't know it yet, the healing had begun. It started not with battle, but with grace, with silence, and with the smallest, most powerful act of all, forgiveness. Some stories end with an explosion, others with silence. But the truest endings, the ones that matter, often unfold slowly, quietly, in the time between battles when no one is watching. That's where healing happens. In the months after the Avengers' fracture, their stories continued, not in the spotlight, but in quiet corners of the world. Each hero walked a different path, learning what it meant to live with the choices they'd made. Sam Wilson Falcon spent much of his time above the clouds. His wings, once used for battles, now helped him travel across continents to aid those in need. He didn't need a spotlight. He never had. Sam brought food to flooded towns, helped rebuild storm-damaged schools, and delivered medicine to forgotten villages. He wasn't saving the world, just parts of it, and that was enough. Sometimes, at night, he would stand on a rooftop and listen. The wind would rush past his face, and for a moment, he felt free. Then he would close his eyes and remember, Steve believed in him. That was more powerful than any shield. In another corner of the world, Wanda Maximoff, once feared as a weapon, began to understand who she was without war. She had been held, watched, controlled, then freed. And in that freedom came a kind of uncertainty, but also calm. She stayed in a remote village for a while, tucked between green hills and quiet rivers. The people there didn't know her name. She simply helped, fixed broken roofs, tended gardens, healed cuts with gentle hands. Wanda learned how to be still. At night, when the stars came out, she would sit by a window and practice her magic, not to destroy, not to defend, but to feel, to remember her brother, her family, and the pain that once shaped her. It hadn't vanished, but it no longer controlled her. Clint Barton, back on his farm, adjusted to normal life once more. He chopped wood, painted his son's bedroom, and taught his youngest how to whistle. Life was slower now, softer. He hadn't forgotten the fight, but he didn't dwell on it either. Sometimes, after dinner, he would sit outside with a warm drink and look up at the sky. He didn't see enemies or threats, just stars. He smiled more these days. And when his children asked for stories, he didn't tell them about arrows or battles. He told them about friends, about trust, and about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Scott Lang had his own version of peace. Cassie was growing up fast, curious, bright, and wonderfully messy. Being her father was the best thing he'd ever done. During the day, they would visit the park or build strange contraptions in the garage. At night, they'd sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching fireflies blink across the lawn. She didn't ask much about the Avengers. She just wanted to know if her dad was happy. And he was. Even in a small house with broken light switches and half-fixed furniture, Scott Lang felt like the richest man alive. And then there was Natasha, always on the move, never quite still. She passed through cities with a scarf around her head, or a pair of sunglasses and a quiet walk. She left no trace, no name. But in her wake, trouble disappeared. A trafficker vanishes. A stolen shipment of medical supplies returns overnight. A border dispute fizzles out before it ignites. Her ledger would never be clean, but she kept trying. Late at night, she would sometimes look in a mirror and barely recognize herself. But she was no longer looking for absolution, just purpose. And she found it in protecting others from the shadows. Even Tony Stark, for all his pride, had changed. He stopped building new suits for a while. Instead, he poured himself into repairing old ones. Not to fly, not to fight, but to understand. He kept the flip phone close. He never spoke about it, but some nights Pepper would find him in the workshop, staring at it. Not angry, just thinking. Tony hadn't called Steve yet, but he hadn't thrown away the number either. Sometimes, healing means holding space for someone who might come back. And in Wakanda, beneath a canopy of trees and sun-dappled hills, the White Wolf slept. Bucky Barnes, cradled in cryogenic rest, waited for the day his mind would be fully his own. He didn't dream often, but when he did, it wasn't of battles or missions. It was of music. Jazz playing on a Brooklyn street. a warm drink held in two steady hands, and laughter, his own, light and genuine. That's how you know a soul is healing, when it begins to imagine joy again. Even in silence, some connections remain unbroken. Though the Avengers had scattered across the globe, though their names no longer filled the news, the threads that held them together still pulsed, thin, quiet, but real. It began with small gestures. One day, Tony Stark received a coded message from a forgotten inbox. No subject line, no attachments, just a sentence. I saw your interview. You were right about the clean energy grid. He knew the signature. It wasn't formal and it wasn't an apology, but it was something. Steve. In Wakanda, a message was passed by hand to a courier, then to a satellite relay, then down again into a simple communicator on Tony's desk. Tony didn't respond at first. He simply read it. Twice. Then he smiled. In a dusty safe house in Morocco, Natasha passed a newspaper stand. The headline spoke of unrest in a small country she'd once visited on a mission. The story didn't mention her, of course, but she noticed the outcome. No casualties. Hostages safe. She knew Clint had been there. He left no trace, but his work was unmistakable. Quiet, precise, humane. Natasha left a note tucked into a train station locker, a place they used to use during missions. She didn't sign it, but she knew he'd find it eventually. It said, simply, nice shot. In a small Chicago apartment, Sam Wilson flipped through a notebook that Steve had once carried. On the last page, written in calm, neat letters, was a list of places Steve wanted to visit now that he had time. One of them was a jazz bar just outside of New Orleans. Sam smiled. He booked a train for the following weekend, just in case Steve showed up. In a coastal village in Ireland, Wanda stopped at a bakery. It was run by a woman who didn't know her past, didn't care about magic or battles. She only knew that Wanda liked the blackberry scones. Every Thursday, they sat by the window and spoke about books, life, music. Wanda didn't mention the Avengers once, but in those conversations, she found healing, a sense of normalcy stronger than any spell. And somewhere in San Francisco, Scott Lang took Cassie to the Science Museum. She wore a tiny lab coat and asked 1,000 questions. When they reached the quantum exhibit, Scott gave her a knowing smile. Someday, he whispered, you're gonna figure this stuff out way better than I ever did. Cassie laughed, tugged on his sleeve, and asked if superheroes ever get tired. Scott thought for a moment, then nodded. All the time, he said, but they keep going. Back at the compound, quiet now, almost like a memory, Tony replaced a broken light fixture in the hangar. He could have asked one of the bots to do it, but something about doing it himself felt good. He didn't wear the suit much these days, not out of fear, just because he was learning to live without it. Still, he kept it nearby, just in case. One night, while working late, the flip phone buzzed. Just once. A text. I hear there's trouble in Jakarta. You free? Tony stared at the screen for a long while. Then, he smiled to himself. Always, he replied. Somewhere, Steve saw the response. He didn't smile big, just a little. Enough. The next morning, Sam received a ping. A location. A rendezvous. He didn't ask questions. He packed a small bag, called Wanda, and left quietly. Clint followed suit, leaving his family with a long hug and a soft promise. Be back soon. Scott left a sticky note on the fridge. Save me a slice of cake. I earned it. They didn't need to call themselves Avengers. That name, like the building, was only part of the story. The real story, the one that mattered, was about the people, the bond they shared, the belief that when something went wrong in the world, they would show up. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not wearing matching uniforms. But they would show up. Because the most important part of being a hero isn't the fight. It's the return. The final chapter of the Civil War didn't end with a handshake, or a press conference, or a reunion. It ended quietly, with a letter. After the fight in Siberia, Steve Rogers disappeared. He and Bucky vanished into the world, away from headlines, away from the consequences that still loomed. He left behind his shield, laying it at Tony's feet, as if to say, I can't be what I was, not anymore. Back at the Avengers compound, Tony Stark returned to a space that felt emptier. Rhodey was recovering, his legs damaged during the battle at the airport. Even with advanced braces, walking was difficult. But Rhodey never complained. He simply moved forward. Tony, too, tried to move forward. That's when the package arrived. A simple envelope. No markings. Just his name. Inside was a flip phone and a handwritten letter from Steve. His voice, through the page, was steady and personal, not filled with regret, but with understanding. Tony, it began. I'm glad you're back at the compound. I heard about Rhodey. I hope he's okay. I know I hurt you. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you what I knew because I thought I was sparing you. But I can see now I was really just sparing myself. Steve explained why he had to protect Bucky, why he had to choose loyalty over law. He admitted the pain his decision caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he offered something else. Help. If you need us, if you ever need me, I'll be there. I know I've hurt you. I hope one day you can understand. Tony read the letter quietly, alone. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a call. But he kept the phone. And somewhere out in the world, Steve broke into the raft. With determination and silence, he freed Sam, Wanda, Clint, and Scott, his teammates imprisoned for standing by him. They didn't speak much. They didn't celebrate. They just walked free into the shadows. In Wakanda, Bucky Barnes stood with T'Challa. Surrounded by the serenity of the forest, Bucky decided to return to cryogenic sleep until Wakandan scientists could find a way to undo Hydra's programming. Steve stayed with him for a while. Watching the chamber close over his oldest friend, Steve knew the war between them may have ended, but the world would need them again. When that day came, he'd answer. The Avengers were gone, but the story wasn't over. Every war leaves something behind. Some leave ashes, others, silence. But some, like this one, leave questions. Long after the battles fade from headlines, long after the heroes walk away, what remains are the choices they made and the meanings hidden beneath them. Civil War was never about power. Not really. It was about trust, about control, about what happens when people who once stood together start to look at the world differently, and neither one is wrong. Captain America, Iron Man, both believed they were doing the right thing, and in a way, they were. Tony Stark believed in accountability, in structure, in laws that could hold even the powerful to a standard. He had seen what unchecked force could do. Ultron had been his creation. Sokovia had been his lesson. And the Accords, in his eyes, were the answer. To Tony, regulation was not about surrender, it was about responsibility. Steve Rogers believed in choice, in personal judgment, in the idea that even the best systems can be corrupted. He had fought Hydra disguised as S.H.I.E.L.D. He had seen what happened when the wrong people hold the reins. To him, freedom could not be traded, even for safety. And so, a rift formed not out of hatred, but out of conviction. That's what made it painful. What do you do when someone you love believes something you can't follow? How do you fight a friend without losing yourself? There's a moment near the end of the film, in the snowy ruins of a Hydra bunker, where Steve and Tony stand face to face, and all the years of friendship, laughter, loss, and loyalty unravel in silence. Tony sees the footage, Bucky, brainwashed, killing his parents. Steve tries to explain. He tries to soften the blow, but the truth is too sharp. Tony asks, "Did you know?" Steve's pause is answer enough. In that pause, we hear everything. Pain, betrayal, the final, quiet collapse of trust. And yet, even then, Steve doesn't raise his shield in anger. He fights only to protect Bucky, not to win. And when it's over, when Tony lies on the ground, arc reactor dimming, heart full of grief, Steve doesn't claim victory. He drops the shield. He walks away. Why? Because the shield, his identity, no longer feels like it belongs to him. Not if it means hurting the people he once called family. In that moment, the symbolism speaks louder than words ever could. He's not Captain America anymore. He's just Steve, a man who chose a friend over a cause. So what makes a hero? Is it strength? Skill? Or is it the courage to choose something, anything, and carry the burden of that choice? In Civil War, no one was all right, and no one was all wrong. That's what made it real. Rhodey, who followed Tony, believed in structure. He believed that power needed boundaries. He paid for that belief with his legs. And yet, he never lost his clarity. We made this mess, he said. We clean it up. Wanda, still learning the reach of her own powers, was torn between remorse and resolve. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she also refused to be locked away for something she couldn't control. Her struggle was not about politics, it was about dignity. Black Widow Natasha stood between the sides. She supported the Accords, but when it mattered most, she let Steve go. Her loyalty wasn't to paper, it was to people. That's who she had become, someone who chose relationships over orders. And then there was Chala, the new king of Wakanda. He began his journey seeking vengeance for his father's death. He believed Bucky was the killer. He hunted with precision, never hesitating. But in the end, he discovered the truth. It was Zemo, not Bucky, who had orchestrated the bombing. And in that realization, something changed in Chala. He did not seek revenge anymore. He chose mercy. He stopped Zemo from taking his own life. And with quiet grace, he said, "The living are not done with you yet." In that moment, Chala became more than a warrior. He became a leader. This is the quiet truth that Civil War reveals. That heroism is not measured in victories, but in the moments where someone chooses grace over rage, restraint over reaction, empathy over certainty. In the end, the Avengers fell apart not because they failed, but because they were human. They disagreed. They hurt one another. And yet, they left space, just enough for healing. The letter Steve sent to Tony wasn't grand. It wasn't polished, but it was honest. "If you ever need me, I'll be there." And Tony, for all his pain, never destroyed the phone. He kept it. Sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it's a light left on, just in case. Civil War didn't end with the world saved. It ended with the world, waiting. Waiting to see if broken people could come back together. Waiting to see if what had been lost could be rebuilt. And maybe, just maybe, it could. Because the most powerful part of this story isn't the shield or the suit or the science. It's the reminder that, in the middle of a fractured world, we can still choose to understand each other. We can still choose to forgive. There is no villain in Civil War. That is one of the film's most powerful truths. The tension isn't built on good versus evil, but on something more unsettling. People who want to do the right thing, but disagree on what that means. At the heart of the conflict are two men, Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. Each is shaped by history, trauma, responsibility, and regret. And in this film, those influences collide. When the Sokovia Accords are introduced, documents demanding that the Avengers operate only under United Nations oversight, it's not a sudden political twist. It's the inevitable result of everything that came before. The world had watched New York fall. It saw Washington's sky rain down helicarriers. It witnessed Sokovia ripped into the air. And then came Lagos. Wanda Maximoff tried to protect civilians when Brock Rumlow detonated himself, but her powers redirected the explosion into a nearby building, killing several Wakandan humanitarian workers. It was a tragedy, not an act of malice. But tragedy is enough to change history. That's where the Accords find their power, not in logic, but in loss. In Vienna, world leaders meet to ratify the agreement. Tony Stark arrives fully in support. To him, this isn't just policy, it's penance. A mother named Miriam had shown him the photo of her son, who died in Sokovia. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply asked, what was the price? Tony's guilt becomes action. He sees oversight as necessary. We need to be put in check, he says. Whatever form that takes, I'm game. Steve Rogers, on the other hand, remembers a different kind of oversight. He remembers SHIELD, a powerful institution infiltrated by Hydra, a government system that nearly enslaved the world through surveillance and preemptive elimination. He remembers how fragile authority can become in the wrong hands. So when the Secretary of State tells him, sign or retire, Steve refuses. He doesn't refuse out of rebellion. He refuses because he believes that doing the right thing sometimes means going against the system. This isn't pride, it's principle. And from that disagreement, the Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes, split. One of the most important truths in the film is that both sides make sense. Tony's side believes that without boundaries, heroes become dangerous. Steve's side believes that if heroes surrender their judgment, they become tools. Neither view is inherently wrong. That's what makes it hurt. The personal relationships make it harder. When Steve finds out Bucky is framed for the Vienna bombing, he protects him, not because he condones what the world believes he's done, but because he knows the man behind the actions. He knows what Hydra did to him. He knows Bucky is still trying to escape that past. Tony sees it differently. To him, Steve's refusal to comply with the law, combined with his defense of Bucky, is betrayal. And in between all of this is T'Challa, the newly crowned king of Wakanda. His father was killed in the bombing, and the image shown to the world points to Bucky. T'Challa moves swiftly, with precision and restraint, to pursue the one he believes responsible. But he learns the truth. Zemo, acting alone, framed Bucky not to destroy the Avengers physically, but to unravel them emotionally. And it works. In Siberia, when Tony watches the footage of his parents' death, realizing Bucky was the killer and that Steve knew, it's not politics anymore. It's personal. There's no accords, no law, no justification, just heartbreak. Steve fights not to defeat Tony, but to protect Bucky. Tony fights out of pain. Every hit lands harder not because of hatred, but because of betrayal. When it's over, Steve drops his shield. He doesn't win. He leaves. And Tony lies on the ground, wounded, but not just in body. That's what civil war truly is, the fracturing of trust. The final scenes are quiet. Tony reads Steve's letter. It's not an apology. It's an acknowledgement of pain and an open hand. If you need us, if you need me, I'll be there. And Steve keeps his word. He breaks his friends out of the raft. He disappears into the world, out of uniform, but not out of belief. The Avengers aren't gone, but they are broken. And yet, they leave space for repair. Not through speeches, not through a grand finale, but through the simple act of leaving the door open. Accountability. That word sits at the heart of Captain America, Civil War. Quietly, insistently. It's not shouted, but it lingers, on lips, in glances, behind every decision. In this film, no one escapes its weight. Not even the people trying to enforce it. The Sokovia Accords begin as a policy document, but they carry emotional gravity. The world is no longer willing to look the other way when destruction follows the heroes. And the Avengers know it. Some feel it more than others. Wanda Maximoff, young, powerful, still grieving, becomes the face of that guilt early in the film. After the mission in Lagos ends in tragedy, the world sees Wanda not as a savior, but as a danger. She tried to save Steve from Rumlow's explosion, but when her powers lifted the blast into the air, it tore through a building instead, killing innocent civilians, many of them Wakandan. The press called it recklessness, but Wanda called it something else. Failure. She didn't intend to hurt anyone, but intentions didn't matter to those who were mourning. Tony Stark sees this too. He doesn't blame Wanda. He doesn't yell, but he acts. He places her under house arrest, confined to the Avengers compound with Vision as her guard. It's for your own good, he says. And yet, behind the calm words is fear. Not of Wanda, but of another mistake, another loss. Tony is haunted by the memory of a mother who handed him a photo of her son, Charles Spencer, bright, studious, kind, dead in Sokovia. She didn't yell, either. She didn't need to. Her grief was enough. And that grief reshapes Tony. He had once joked about the consequences of his inventions. He had once shielded himself with sarcasm and suits. But not anymore. In Civil War, we see a Tony Stark who's trying to make things right, not with technology, but with policy. He sees the Accords as a necessary limit, not because he wants to give up freedom, but because he believes freedom without oversight leads to harm. This is how guilt works in Civil War. It doesn't just sit in silence. It moves people to act, sometimes in ways that cause even more division. Rhodey supports Tony, not just because of friendship, but because of order. If we can't accept limitations, he says, we're no better than the bad guys. But the consequences come for him too. At the airport in Leipzig, Vision, trying to disable Sam's flight pack, accidentally strikes Rhodey midair. He falls. Fast. Hard. The impact shatters his body. He survives. But everything changes. Vision, usually calm and precise, is shaken. I became distracted, he admits. What distracted him was Wanda, his attempt to understand her, to connect with her. In that moment, emotion disrupted logic. And someone paid the price. This is what Civil War shows us about accountability. It is not always imposed from the outside. Sometimes it comes from within, from the guilt we carry, from the lives we touch without meaning to, from the silence that follows when things fall apart. Even Natasha Romanoff feels the shift. She begins the film in favor of the Accords. She speaks at the Vienna conference. She asks Steve to sign. We need to win their trust back, she says. But when push comes to shove, when Steve and Bucky are trying to escape the airport, she lets them go. She doesn't choose sides. She chooses people. Later, when confronted, she says simply, I had to make a judgment call. And that's what the film asks of every character. Not just whether they'll comply or rebel, but whether they can live with their choices. Can you carry the weight of hurting someone if you believed you were doing the right thing? Can you forgive yourself for saving one person and losing another? Can you admit that you tried and still failed? For Tony Stark, the answer is hard-earned. In Siberia, when he sees footage of his parents being murdered, his mother, Maria, killed without mercy, his calm dissolves. Even knowing Bucky wasn't in control, even understanding Steve's reasons, he can't look past it. He killed my mom. Those words, said so softly, become louder than anything else. And they drive him not toward justice, but toward revenge. In that moment, accountability becomes personal, and the fallout is permanent. Steve fights back, not because he wants to, but because he has to. He protects Bucky. He disables Tony's suit. And then, quietly, he walks away. His shield, the symbol of his title, is left behind. Because that title, that power, had cost too much. What remains is damage. To friendships, to trust, to the very idea of unity. And yet, there is still space for something else. Steve leaves a letter. Tony reads it alone. In it, Steve doesn't erase what happened. He doesn't beg for understanding. He simply says, if you need me, I'll be there. That's the closing note Civil War offers us. Not clean resolution, but the smallest thread of hope. That accountability can be more than punishment. That it can be growth. That guilt doesn't have to end with silence. It can end with healing. There are many battles in Civil War, but the deepest one is between friends. Steve Rogers and Tony Stark didn't start out close. Their first meeting had tension. Tony was sharp, irreverent, used to being the smartest in the room. Steve was steady, principled, rooted in a time where values felt more certain. But over time, something grew between them. Not just cooperation, not just respect, something more personal. They fought together, bled together, saved the world more than once. By the time Civil War begins, that bond matters, maybe more than either of them admits. That's what makes the split so painful. When the Sokovia Accords are presented, their disagreement isn't about ego. It's about worldview. Tony supports oversight because he wants to protect people from the unintended consequences of their power. And, maybe more quietly, because he wants to atone. Steve resists because he knows what happens when good intentions become control. He's seen freedom taken under the name of security. Neither one tries to dominate the other. They just stop seeing eye to eye. There's a moment early on when Tony tells Steve, if we can't accept limitations, we're no better than the bad guys. And Steve answers, that's not the way I see it. It's quiet, simple, but it's the beginning of the end. As the story unfolds, their choices keep pulling them apart. Steve chooses to protect Bucky, his oldest friend, wrongfully blamed for the Vienna bombing. Tony sees that choice as betrayal not just of the law, but of trust. By the time they confront each other in Berlin, the split is almost complete. And yet, even then, there's no hatred, just disappointment, sadness. When they finally fight in Siberia, it isn't about politics anymore. It's about pain. Tony sees footage of his parents' death, sees Bucky, under Hydra control, carry out the murder, and he realizes Steve knew. That's the moment everything breaks. Tony isn't fighting the Winter Soldier. He's fighting the truth. Did you know? He asks. Steve hesitates. Yes. It's that pause, small but devastating, that turns grief into rage. The fight that follows is brutal, not just in punches or strikes, but in emotion. Every hit carries a lifetime of buried feelings. And yet, Steve doesn't strike to kill. He disables Tony's suit. And when Tony tells him, "You don't deserve that shield," Steve doesn't argue. He drops it. Because he knows some things can't be defended in the moment. Some wounds need time. Later, at the compound, Tony receives Steve's letter. It's quiet, personal. Steve doesn't excuse what he did. He doesn't beg for forgiveness. He simply explains. He says that friendship doesn't mean always agreeing, but it does mean showing up when it matters. If you ever need me, I'll be there. Tony doesn't answer, but he keeps the phone. That's what makes their story in Civil War so human. There is no villain between them, only fear and love and loss. In the end, Civil War doesn't give us a clean reconciliation. It gives us something more honest. A fracture, not beyond repair, but real. And it reminds us that even among heroes, even in the brightest lights, there are moments of deep shadow, not because of failure, but because of how much they care. The war between friends did not end in Civil War. It simply went quiet. But when the next great threat emerged, the cost of that fracture became clear. Avengers. Infinity War begins not with unity, but with absence. The Avengers are scattered, broken, no longer a team, not in name, and not in action. And when Thanos comes, the Earth is not ready. Tony Stark is still in New York. His armor is more advanced, his sense of urgency deeper. He's been preparing for years, not just for the return of an alien threat, but for the return of a mistake he can't stop replaying. He still carries the phone. Steve Rogers, now operating in the shadows, works off-grid. With Sam and Natasha, he stops threats quietly, without titles or oversight. He has a beard now. His uniform is stripped of its star. He is not Captain America. He is a man who made a choice and continues to live with it. The world is different because of Civil War. There is no longer one team. There are two paths, walking in silence. And when Bruce Banner returns to Earth with a warning that Thanos is coming, Tony hesitates before making the call. The tension lingers, but he knows they'll need everyone. So he opens the phone. That act, so small, is a consequence of Civil War. A sign that the fracture, though deep, was not permanent. When Steve answers the call, he does so without condition. He returns instantly. There is no hesitation in his movement, only in his expression. The world is in danger. Whatever came before, the shield, the letter, the fight, no longer matters. This is what Civil War taught them all. That disagreements don't mean disloyalty. But when crisis returns, unity is no longer easy. In Infinity War, we see the cost of their separation in real time. Tony and Steve never reunite. They fight on separate fronts, Tony in space, Steve on Earth. When the Battle of Wakanda erupts, Steve leads with quiet strength. He fights beside T'Challa, Wanda, Bucky, and others who once stood at his side in Civil War. The bond between them has not broken. But Tony is alone with Peter, Strange, and the Guardians. And when the snap happens, when Thanos wins, that separation becomes permanent. Because Tony lives. And Steve is left to mourn those who vanished. In Endgame, the pain resurfaces. The first time Tony sees Steve again, it is not warm. It is not friendly. It is honest. Tony is angry. You said we'd lose, he says. You said, we'll do that together too. Well, you weren't there. And Steve doesn't defend himself. Because he knows. They lost, in part, because they weren't together. That's what Civil War left behind. Not just a broken shield, but a broken line of communication. And yet, Endgame brings them back. Not with a speech, not with forgiveness, but with time. Time to understand. Time to heal. Tony builds a family. Steve carries on quietly, leading those who are left. And when they do reunite, truly it is because of a shared goal, a shared belief that what they broke, they can help restore. Civil War was not a closed story. It was a turning point, the moment when the Avengers stopped being a team and slowly became a family again, not because they agreed, but because they learned what it meant to fall apart and still come back together. When the dust settles, what remains? Not the battles, not the debris, not even the headlines. What remains are the people, the choices they made, and the space left behind by what they lost. Captain America, Civil War was not just about policy or power. It was about how close we can stand to one another and how easily the ground beneath us can shift. It began with belief. Steve Rogers believed in individual freedom, that each person, no matter how powerful, had to be responsible for their own actions and their own conscience. Tony Stark believed in collective safety, that with power must come accountability, even if that meant surrendering control. Both beliefs were forged in fire. Steve had lived through a war where governments betrayed their people. Tony had created an artificial intelligence that nearly ended the world. Their experiences didn't make them opposites. They made them honest. This was never a fight between right and wrong. It was a fight between wounds, between what people feared could happen again and what they could no longer allow. In that conflict, trust was lost, but not love. Even at their most divided, Steve and Tony didn't hate each other. What they felt and what we saw was grief. The grief of betrayal, the grief of disappointment, the grief of watching someone you respect walk a path you can't follow. And yet, even in that silence, they left each other a way back. Steve's letter, Tony's unspoken forgiveness. Neither of them said, "I'm sorry," but both of them showed it. This is what makes Civil War different from other battles in the Marvel Universe. There is no villain in the center, only pain. Zemo, who pulled the strings, did so out of sorrow, not for glory, not for conquest, but for a family lost in Sokovia, collateral damage from a war the Avengers barely survived. He didn't need to win. He only needed them to lose each other. And for a time, they did. But that loss revealed something powerful, that heroes are not perfect. They make mistakes. They argue. They hurt each other. And still, they return. When the world breaks again, they come back. Not because they have to, but because they choose to. Steve lifts the shield again. Tony reaches out. Natasha finds a cause worth dying for. Wanda learns to stand alone and then beside others. Even Bucky, once buried in guilt, learns that healing is possible. All of this begins in Civil War. That's the legacy. Not the airport fight, not the fractured team, but the journey back. The quiet understanding that being a hero isn't about standing tall. It's about learning how to stand up again when the people you trusted are no longer beside you. And maybe finding them again. One day. Not through battle, but through grace. Through time. Through something as small as a letter or a phone left charged. Or a shield waiting to be lifted. That's what remains. Not war, but hope. Whether you came here to relax, to focus, or to simply step away from the noise of the day, thank you for spending this time here. Sometimes stories give us answers. Sometimes they give us space to think. And sometimes they simply offer a quiet place to breathe. Wherever you are, in your room, at your desk, on a walk, or lying quietly in bed, may the stillness stay with you. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. If your mind is clear, stay there. And if the world feels a little softer, then the story did its part. When you're ready, you can wake slowly or drift further. You're safe to rest here. Until next time, take care.